Hello, this is Dr. Harold Wong, and today we're going to cover the contents of an article that was published June 20th, 2012 in the Arizona Republic. And its title is Financial Greed is Not Worth the Risk of Regret. So let's cover it. We're going to cover two different case studies. The first has to do with the real estate market. During the peak of the real estate market in Arizona, California, Nevada, Florida, and most of the country, the peak of the market was toward the end of 2005. And here's an example. This was so common where people said, I want to buy that big house in 2005 because all my friends are buying that big house in the new home subdivision. So the family buys a $420,000 home, and it's their dream home. And they put $20,000 down, leaving a loan balance of $400,000. It's got everything they want. It's got 3,000 square feet, 5 bedrooms, 3 baths, 3-car garage, maybe a pool, good landscaping. They say, this is fantastic. But how do you afford it? Well, let's go through the numbers. Back then, you had liar loans, which meant that if you had a great credit score, you literally lied about how much income you got, and the loan officer, whether it was Bank of America, the other big banks, or independent mortgage brokers, they would go wink, wink. They knew what was happening because the big banks in Wall Street wanted these types of mortgages because the bigger the loan, the more money they made. Well, there was something called a negative amortization mortgage, where the true rate of interest was 7%, but for the first 5 years, you only had to pay 2%. The other 5% of that $400,000 loan, or $20,000 a year, was added toward your principal. So guess what? At the end of 5 years, instead of owing $400,000, you owed $500,000. And even worse, at the end of 5 years, you only had 25 years left to amortize the original 30-year loan term, and you had to pay the full 7% interest. So guess what? Your payments increase. So for the first 5 years of the loan, your payments were $1,476 a month. And of course, that doesn't count real estate tax, homeowners association, and homeowners insurance. But if the family earned $5,000 a month, they could afford that. That was great. But after 5 years, when the loan resets, here's what happens. The monthly payment becomes $3,513 a month, which is 70% of the family's $5,000 a month income. That's clearly unaffordable. And even worse, with the real estate crash, the value of houses has dropped in half. So instead of being worth $420,000, the house was worth $210,000, and yet they owe $500,000, and they can't afford the $3,500 a month payments. So guess what? Millions of people lost their home. Short sale, foreclosure, deed in lieu of foreclosure. So here's an example. The moral of the story is the greed, 5 years of living in a new, big, expensive house that you can't afford, was probably not worth the financial and emotional regret of losing the house and your credit score. Let's go to a second example. The example is a senior couple, age 70, came into my office. They had saved $600,000. Their combined Social Security income was $2,000 a month, and they had no pension. And yet, they were spending $3,000 a month. So there's a $1,000 a month deficit. What choices do they have? Well, let's take a look at it. First of all, we know that they can put their money in 5-year CDs, but banks aren't paying much interest. That earns 1%. So if they had put their money, and let's suppose they had $600,000, and they put it at 1% interest, that'd only give them $6,000 a year of income. That only covers half of that deficit of $12,000 a year. Well, second solution, they can invest the $600,000 in treasury bonds. Well, on June 8th, 2012, fears of what's going to happen in Greece blowing up and leaving the euro drove the benchmark 10-year treasury bond rates down to a lower than in at least 60 years. It was down only 1.46% it was paying. So over 10 years, you're only going to get 1.46% of interest. And the 30-year Treasury bond was only paying 2.56%. So if you put $300,000 in 10-year Treasury bonds and the other $300,000 in 30-year Treasury bonds, you'd only average about 2% interest. So 2% times 600,000 would be 12,000, and that would fill that deficit, because remember they needed 12,000 a year to cover their spending. However, there's no inflation protection. So let me tell you the effects of inflation. Well, guess what? If we only assume the long-term 3% inflation rate that allegedly we've had over the last 50 years, here's what would happen. In 10 years, they would need 48,381 to equal what 36,000 buys today. Of course, that assumes that they pay no taxes on their income. Well, that's not realistic. So you see, inflation is going to hurt them badly in the future. Let's go to the third option. They can invest the $600,000 in the stock market. Well, if the account grows by a third, goes from $600,000 to $800,000, they're happy. But what if it drops by a third? So they start with $600,000. If they lose a third and they lose $200,000, now they've got only $400,000. And given the low interest rates that I've already mentioned, guess what? They're in deep financial trouble. So what would be a better solution, a safer solution? I suggested deposit $400,000 in a private pension fund and just wait 1 year to take your income. Their income from the private pension fund would be about $23,000 a year, guaranteed to last as long as either spouse was alive. When you add their current $24,000 of combined Social Security, they've got more than enough to cover the $36,000 a year that they're spending now. If we only assume a 2% annual increase with the cost of living adjustment in their Social Security, that Social Security will grow from $24,000 to $29,255 when it get to age 80. Because remember, this couple is age 70. If we add $23,000 from the private pension fund, their total income is $52,255. And this exceeds the $48,381, which is the inflation-adjusted amount they would need at age 80. And so they have more than enough income, even adjusting for inflation, to cover the rest of their life. So here's the moral of the story. The long-term security of a private pension fund is probably better than the possibility of making stock market profits. In other words, we have to give up financial greed to avoid long-term regret. Well, that's all for today. If you want to find out more about these issues, such as risk versus reward, or seniors and baby boomers and investments for their retirement future, go to my blog site, drwonginvestorguide.com.